A woodcarving mage, hidden power, unyielding restraint. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village. In the foothills of the Ironspire Mountains lay the quaint village of Eldham. Its cobblestone streets wound through clusters of thatched roof cottages, each adorned with blooming window boxes and the soft hum of domestic life. Farmers tilled the fertile fields, bakers filled the air with the scent of fresh bread, and blacksmiths forged tools to support their neighbors' livelihoods. It was an unassuming place, perfect for a man like Cain. Cain had lived in Eldham for nearly a decade. His small, ivy-covered cottage sat at the edge of the village, where the forest loomed tall and serene. Most villagers knew him as a quiet craftsman who excelled at carving wood into elegant furniture. Few suspected that the grey-haired, broad-shouldered man had once been the archmage of Veldra, the strongest magic wielder of his generation. Cain's past was a secret he preferred to keep buried. After decades of war, political intrigue, and battles that scarred the very land, he'd walked away from it all. The world had been saved from calamity, but the cost had been too high. Friends lost, landscapes ravaged, and an understanding of his own terrifying power that haunted him. He had no desire to wield magic again. The peace of Eldham soothed him. It was the sort of life he'd longed for during his years of strife. Here, he could carve chairs and tables, enjoy the harvest festivals, and read by the fireplace without the burden of destiny pressing on his shoulders. But peace, as Cain knew too well, was fragile. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in hues of gold and violet, the peace shattered. A rider galloped into the village square, his horse lathered in sweat. The man's armor bore the crest of Duke Beltran, the local lord, and his face was ashen. "Monsters!" the rider gasped, collapsing from his mount. "A band of orcs from the Northlands. They're headed this way." Panic spread like wildfire. Villagers scrambled to gather their families, board up their homes, or flee into the surrounding woods. Cain watched from his doorstep, his heart heavy. He had seen this before, innocents caught in the tide of violence. The temptation to act burned at the edge of his consciousness. But no, someone else could handle it. A local militia, a wandering knight, a passing band of adventurers, anyone but him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and turned back inside, until he heard the scream of a child. Chapter 2. Reluctant Defender. Cain moved before he could think. The scream had come from the main square, where a handful of orcs had already broken through the village's meager defenses. Their hulking forms towered over the fleeing villagers, their axes and clubs leaving trails of destruction. In the center of the chaos, a young boy had tripped, his wide eyes frozen on an advancing orc. The creature raised its weapon, saliva dripping from its jagged teeth. Cain's hand twitched, and before he knew it, a flicker of magic surged from his fingers. A pulse of raw energy shot across the square, slamming into the orc with the force of a battering ram. The creature was flung backward, crashing into a wooden cart that splintered under the impact. The boy scrambled to his feet and ran, tears streaming down his face. Cain cursed under his breath. He'd promised himself he wouldn't use magic again, and here he was, breaking that vow. But he couldn't stop now, not with the village under attack. More orcs poured into the square. Cain stepped forward, his boots crunching on the cobblestones. He raised his hand, muttering words he hadn't spoken in years. Arcane glyphs spun to life around him, glowing with an otherworldly light. The air hummed with power as a sphere of flame materialized above his palm. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled it at the advancing horde. The explosion lit up the square, sending orcs flying in all directions. Some fled, others roared in defiance, but none could stand against the onslaught of Cain's magic. Within minutes, the attackers were routed. The village square was silent once more, save for the crackle of smoldering wood. Villagers emerged cautiously from their hiding places, their eyes wide with awe and fear. Cain felt their stares boring into him, their unspoken questions hanging in the air. Who was this man? How could he wield such power? Cain turned and walked away, his heart heavy. He'd saved them, yes, but he'd also drawn attention to himself, attention he'd spent years avoiding. He tried to retreat to his workshop, burying himself in the rhythmic sanding of wood. But the memories of the square haunted him. the way the orcs had fallen, the whispers that followed. He knew the peace he'd built for himself was beginning to crumble. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Past. Word of the attack spread quickly, as did rumors of the mysterious mage who had saved Eldam. By morning, the village was abuzz with speculation. Cain tried to resume his normal routine, but the whispers followed him everywhere. "Did you see him?" a baker murmured to her husband. "He summoned fire like it was nothing." "Could he be one of the old war mages?" an elderly farmer wondered aloud. Cain ignored them, focusing on his work. He sanded the surface of a chair with deliberate care, each stroke of the sandpaper a meditation. But his peace was short-lived. A knock at the door interrupted his efforts. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with a knight in gleaming armor. The man was young, with sharp features and an air of self-assurance. His tabard bore the emblem of Duke Beltran. "Master Cain," the knight said, bowing slightly, "I am Sir Alric. The Duke has heard of your heroics and requests your aid. The orc attack was but a scouting party. A larger force marches south as we speak." Cain's grip on the door tightened. "You have the wrong man," he said. "I am just a woodcarver." Sir Alric frowned. "The villagers say otherwise. Please, Master Cain. Hundreds of lives are at stake. Will you not help us?" For a moment, Cain was silent. He saw the desperation in the knight's eyes, the weight of responsibility pressing down on the young man. It reminded him too much of his own past. "I can't." "Find someone else," Cain said with sorrow and defeat in his voice. He closed the door before Alric could respond. But the knight's words lingered, an echo of the world Cain thought he'd left behind. He returned to his work, yet every sound from the village carried urgency, shouts of preparation, the clatter of tools. It was a past Cain could not avoid forever. Chapter 4. Breaking Point. The next few days were tense. Refugees from nearby villages streamed into Eldam, their stories painting a grim picture. Orc warbands were pillaging the countryside, leaving destruction in their wake. The villagers' pleas for Cain to act grew more insistent, but he held firm. He had given enough of himself to the world. Someone else had to step up. That someone turned out to be Sir Alric. The young knight rallied the villagers, organizing a militia to defend the town. They were brave, but inexperienced, and the weight of their task was daunting. Cain watched from a distance, a knot of guilt forming in his chest. Each time Alric's voice rang out rallying the villagers, Cain felt the pull to act, to aid. Still, he resisted. The attack came at dawn. Horns blared as orcs charged the village, their war cries echoing through the valley. The militia fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. It was chaos, a blur of clashing steel, screaming villagers, and flames consuming the thatched roofs. Sir Alric, his sword gleaming in the morning light, led the charge, his voice ringing out with commands and encouragement. But even his skill and bravery couldn't turn the tide. Cain stood at the edge of the battlefield, his fists clenched. He told himself it wasn't his fight. He told himself the villagers would understand. But when he saw Sir Alric fall, blood staining the young knight's tabard as orcs surged over him like a wave, something snapped inside him. Memories of other battles, of other faces lost to war, flooded his mind. He could no longer stand idle. He stepped forward, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Every fiber of his being screamed against what he was about to do, but the decision had already been made. Cain raised his hand, drawing deep from the well of magic he had sworn never to touch again. His voice, steady and commanding, spoke the words of power that had once made him a legend. Chapter 5. The Unleashing. The orcs barely had time to react. A wave of energy rippled through the battlefield, sending them sprawling like leaves before a storm. Cain advanced, his eyes glowing with an intense golden light. He moved his hands in precise fluid motions, weaving spells with a mastery that defied comprehension. The villagers and militia could only watch in stunned silence as the tide of battle shifted before their eyes. Flames roared to life, consuming entire swaths of the enemy. Lightning cracked from the sky, striking with pinpoint accuracy and leaving scorched craters in its wake. The ground itself trembled, rising up in jagged spikes to impale the advancing horde. Orcs screamed in terror, their confidence shattered by the sheer magnitude of Kane's power. Each step he took was measured, deliberate, a reminder of the power he held. Kane's magic was a symphony of destruction, each spell a carefully orchestrated note in the song of his fury. But even as he fought, a part of him recoiled at what he was doing. He could feel the weight of his power pressing down on him, the temptation to let it consume him entirely. He had to stay in control. He had to remember why he'd given it up in the first place. By the time the battle ended, not a single orc remained. The battlefield was eerily quiet, save for the crackle of burning wood and the groans of wounded villagers. Kane stood in the center of the devastation, the air around him still shimmering with residual magic. His shoulders slumped and he let out a long, weary breath. The glow faded from his eyes, leaving only exhaustion behind. The villagers began to cheer, their voices filled with gratitude and relief. They approached him cautiously, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. Kane felt their eyes on him, their unspoken questions hanging in the air. He turned away, walking back toward his cottage without a word. Chapter 6: True Price of Power. In the aftermath of the battle, Kane became a hero to the villagers. They celebrated him, offering gifts and praise. But Kane withdrew further into himself. He knew the truth. His power was not a blessing, but a burden. Every spell he had cast, every life he had taken, weighed heavily on his soul. Sir Alric, recovering from his wounds, sought Kane out. The young knight's face was pale but determined, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You saved us," he said. "You've given us hope. Isn't that worth something?" Kane shook his head, his expression grim. "Power like mine comes at a cost," he said. "I've seen what it can do. I've lived with the consequences. It's not hope I bring, but danger. You saw it, Alric. The destruction I wrought. That wasn't just the orcs. That was me." Alric frowned but didn't argue. He seemed to understand, at least in part. "What will you do now?" he asked. Kane looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, casting the valley in hues of gold and crimson. "I don't know," he admitted. "For now, I'll stay. The village needs time to rebuild, and I'll do what I can to help. But after that..." He trailed off, his gaze distant. Alric nodded, placing a hand on Kane's shoulder. "Whatever path you choose, know that you'll always have allies here. You've done more for us than we could ever repay." Kane didn't respond. He returned to his cottage, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. He tried to find solace in his woodworking, but the memories of the battle lingered, refusing to fade. He knew the world wouldn't let him stay hidden forever. The forces of darkness would rise again, and when they did, people would come looking for him. For now, though, the village was safe, and Kane would savor that peace, fleeting as it might be. He could only hope that the next time he was called to action, he'd be strong enough to wield his power without losing himself entirely. If you've enjoyed this story and would like to hear some more, do let us know in the comments below. And also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us a lot. Thanks.